And now, the survival show which once survived an extreme case of monkey butt. In this episode, we sit down with author Mathew Gilman, and he's going to tell us all about his book, Homefront. Howdy, and welcome to In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 183. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Mathew, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you for having me.
So now, tell us real quick, so you're an author. You actually have a lot of books out. How many books do you have?
I have 10 altogether. 7 are post-apocalyptic fiction. Most of it is my additional series, starting with After the Day. It's called the Future Collapse series. And it follows a group of people in the Midwest who are left in a situation that they're lost trying to be able to survive. They make pacts with people who in everyday life they wouldn't necessarily come in contact with. People are kind of thrown together in uncomfortable situations for the most part, and a lot of horrible things happen over a long period of time. It's not a series that there's an initial event and then you see like a week or two later where there's a ton of death and destruction. The series takes place over several years. So it's more, if I had to compare it to something, it'd be World Made by Hand, like Kunstler,
Okay.
where he comes into play like years after an economic downturn. And my book, my series of books, is actually different events. I always looked at collapse as being something that isn't going to be just one event. It's not going to be like a super volcano or something like that throws the entire world under. It's going to be one horrible event leading to another horrible event, and nobody really has time to adapt, and so they're constantly trying to adapt what their new situations are going to be.
So more of a cascading set of failures.
Yeah, I like to look at it as kind of like the Roman Empire, where they overexpanded. That led to not having the military power to defend themselves, and then there's the plague, and then there's a whole series of things that led to the end of the Roman Empire. And I feel like even with the United States, you look at something dramatic like 9/11, and you would think that a horrible event like that would send the entire system cascading down, and that's not the case. It would take 9/11 plus a super volcano plus probably a plague after that in order to really send the whole system down. And that's one thing that I tried to do with my book. And initially it starts out with a nuclear detonation in Washington, D.C., and that sends the country into chaos. But then the whole power grid and everything turns off after that, and that's the second event that really sends everything down because they're already in a panic, and then you can't communicate. There's no transportation. Nobody knows what the heck is going on. There's no news, and so that's the second event that really kicks things into gear.
So now, is that second event, is that your newer book, Homefront?
You learn who perpetrated that. It's mentioned, it's in the previous books, but because I tried to keep an isolated situation with the characters, they don't learn as to who did it, what outside forces were responsible.
Uh-huh.
Their only option is to learn how to survive and go from there.
So let's back up a little bit. How did you come to writing?
I've always written. It's just something that early on wasn't really encouraged to do, and later on, I got divorced a couple years ago, and that was a time period where it was kind of like rediscovering myself.
Mm-hmm.
one of the first things I did was I bought a laptop, and I knew I wanted to write. I didn't even touch the laptop for about a year. And I started reading a couple different things. One of the books that really got me interested in post-apocalyptic fiction was James Wesley Rawls' Survivors. And I really loved that book. It was just, I wanted to see different things from it. And I was reading other things in the same genre, and I felt like I was kind of reading the same thing over and over again. And that was when I decided to write my own.
So why were you drawn necessarily to dystopian fiction?
I was kind of getting a unique perspective of the world. I worked in healthcare for 14 years, and I started getting interested in politics and economics and other things during that time. And I just didn't like to see where the healthcare industry was going, where our banking system was going. I started reading about the food industry and the type of things that were going on with our food that wasn't regulated, that you go to the supermarket, and I had to start asking myself, like, what kind of plant was this sausage made in? And, like when, for example, cows, when they're butchered, there's this whole long process that's condensed into maybe an hour. And it's not the cleanest method. There's all these horrible things that happen along the way. And there isn't, because it's more time oriented, things aren't done properly. And so I started becoming conscientious of how different things were going on in our system. And food was one of them. The banking system, 2009 was a real eye opener for me, with how the banks were just able to hold the whole country hostage, and nobody was willing to stand up for them, especially the people who were supposed to. And that was another thing that played into it.
And so with the writing, it was, you started reading other people's works, such as James Wesley Rawls. And I guess if I'm getting this right, so you looked at it and said, I really enjoy this, but for me, there are parts missing, or there are things missing, or elements, or perhaps a storyline or characters that are missing. Is that how it worked out for you?
I was reading other things too, like Earth Abides, Alas Babylon. And I always found that these books, it was always a primarily white military Christian character. So they were very stereotypical. And I live in a college town. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of diversity. There's a lot of different cultures here. We have really great Indian, Chinese restaurants. You go downtown to a lot of the different festivals, and you see this collage of different people. And so looking at America as that melting pot of culture, I wanted to have different cultures within the books, because it's not just the stereotypical middle-class America that's going to be affected by something like that. And Right. You're going to have different perspectives brought out from different cultures that live here.
So that's a really interesting and unique point about that. How does that play into the book for you? Is it creating race tensions, or what? Like, walk us into that, because that actually, you just hit on something there that is quite fascinating. And you brought up a good point. Like most of post-apocalyptic fiction is the stereotypical Anglo-Protestant guy with some sort of military background. That's interesting. How does that play into the book for you? Walk us into that.
It plays into the series, especially with the Future Collapse series, a lot. When the initial collapse happens, there's a lot of racial tensions. People on all sides are trying to blame everyone else for what's going on. And it's a very common thing that we see in societies, and you can view it now in Greece and Europe right now with all the immigration and stuff. So there's groups hunting each other down, but at the same time, if you keep in mind that everybody's still an American, but they're separating themselves from that. One of my main characters is a doctor named Fatima, and she's actually based on a couple of different people that I know from my previous life in healthcare. And she's Middle Eastern. She immigrated here to go to med school. Once she got here and she learned American culture, what kind of freedoms it afforded her and what she was able to do with her life that wasn't granted to her in her home country, she adapted to it. She decided that she was going to become a U.S. citizen. She's working at a hospital and an ER when the collapse happens. So here's a person who's a very positive example of why our country is so great when it comes to immigration and the opportunities that we provide, especially to people important like doctors. And she had no interest in going back. But when the collapse happens, she's one of those people that the public are trying to hunt down, blaming people because of her background, her ethnicity, for what's happening in the country. But yet she's a good guy. You know, she's been the same people who are hunting her down are the same people a week before would have gone to the ER and said, "Please fix my leg." Mm-hmm. You know, so that's something that I really wanted to touch on, and I actually got a lot of criticism for that with the first couple books. There's one review in particular where the guy got 70 pages into the book and he said, everything was fine and dandy until you brought this Muslim person into it. And it's like, she doesn't even associate herself with that religion. She doesn't practice it. She was raised in it. But then once she came to the United States, unlike Syria and all these other countries where it's illegal and you will be executed for leaving the religion, America affords them the opportunity to say, I don't want to do this anymore. Mm-hmm. And she was one of those people that took advantage of that. And yet there's a lot of ignorance within our culture on subject matter like that. We look at, and there are examples of people coming here and they still think that they can practice a lot of the negative aspects of the religion within our own country, even though it's illegal, like the honor killings and stuff like that, we've seen in London, stuff like that. Obviously, we can't tolerate, but that doesn't mean that everybody does it.
That's really interesting. So is that the only cultural friction that you introduce into the book, or are there other instances or that you introduce it as an overarching theme?
There's a few others. Primarily, I wanted to focus on Fatima because writing in a novel format, you want to have a character and really with a dynamic background, and you find out like what they're going through, and you really connect with them. But there are other things, like I do mention how in Detroit and Chicago, there's a lot of racial tensions there, where there's definitely there's the government aspect who's trying to keep control, but then there's the white and the black aspect that are going back and forth. And I also touched on not Flint, I'm trying to remember, Dearborn. Michigan has one of the highest Islamic populations within the country. We've got 40,000 former Iraqis and Iranians living in Dearborn. Mm. And so I really played on that because I felt like that community by itself, there were, I think, 70% of the population of Dearborn, this huge community that's condensed into this small area. And I felt like they would it'd be kind of like the Koreans and the LA riots, where they would band together to protect themselves and their property, but then there could also be negative aspects of that as well. Like maybe they'd look at it as like, oh, this is our chance to really kind of expand our thing and do our own thing. And with the LA riots, we saw the Koreans, guys with ARs on top of supermarkets protecting their buildings and stuff. And I felt like that was a real positive aspect of community with that. Like you didn't really see it everywhere else. I feel like my culture as a white male, everybody tends to want to be like very independent. I'm going to protect my home, but screw that guy down the street. Whereas the Koreans were very, okay, let's go protect Han's place down here, and we'll be able to block off that end of the street. And they're thinking about the entire community as opposed to just one shop here, one shop there. Yeah. And I did play around with that in Red Tide, where with the collapse, the Koreans did band together just like they did with the LA riots, and they had a central leader and kind of followed her story. And what happened with them and how she guided them into surviving with what was happening over there.
I gotcha. Okay. Interesting. So what, and I guess to back up even further, even past your writing, do you consider yourself a prepper or a survivalist, or you're one of those who are like, I don't care what label you put on me? I think the whole debate is stupid. Where do you fall with that?
Well, I think prepper itself has a bad connotation with the TV show on Nat Geo, and survivalist has that wacky persona of like the Unabomber.
The 1980s, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't really know what I would call myself. I do. I'm not exactly a well-off person. I don't make that much money. So when it comes to all the gadgets and doohickeys and the ARs and stockpiling all kinds of stuff, I can't afford to do that kind of thing. So I really focus on skills, knowledge, spending some time out in the woods, identifying new food sources, fishing, hunting season. You'll find me out in the woods, learning all kinds of different things. So survivalist, I think, by the sound of it, I would associate more with, but when it comes to like all the negative stuff that comes along with stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think any of us really want to be associated with the more negative kind of caricature that the media likes to paint out of, or the mainstream media likes to paint out of our niche. So I'm just curious. Some people get real wound up. Oh, I'm a survivalist, and some people are just like, I don't care. I was just curious where you fell with that, and I guess that also leads us to. So you've told us a little bit about it, but I guess really walk us into it. How did you come to prepping? And how did you come to survival and all this?
My parents did some stuff when I was growing up, and I think a lot of it was more a fad of the time. 1980s Cold War was still in effect, and so I grew up with my parents canning vegetables and fruits. My stepdad would try to go hunting every year. Never really brought anything back unless he hit it with the truck. But so there were some things that they did along the way that kind of opened my eyes. But then the wall fell, and that wasn't throughout the '90s. Stuff like that wasn't really a priority. Like they didn't do that anymore. And for me, I watched Collapse with Michael Rupert. That really opened my eyes to what was going on financially and with the how dependent we are on foreign oil, things like that. I didn't really like politically where things were going on in the Middle East, so I started looking at, well, if I can't afford or if I can't get gasoline, what do I do? If the power goes out, what do I do? And I started asking a bunch of these questions. I really got into how much food I could produce out of my backyard. I live in the middle of the city. Not the ideal place for somebody who might consider themselves a prepper or survivalist, but I never really cared for driving 30 miles to work. Yeah. Either way, I felt like I could live out in the middle of nowhere and then drive to work, which pays for everything, or I could actually live by work and get back and forth even on foot if I need to. And that's kind of where I'm at today. And so I really looked at locally in the city with my lot. I've got a decent sized yard. How much food I could produce if I needed to, what I would need to do in order to get the soil up to optimal working conditions. So I started composting. I played around with a lot of heirloom seeds in order to find out what best grew in my area. And I was fortunate enough to find a couple of companies locally that they actually test all of the products that they sell seed-wise as to our climate, our soil, what grows best in Michigan. And so that ended up being a big time and money saver too, because they could say, hey, we grew these tomatoes, these came out of Oregon or Washington State or something, but we found that they did really good here. And so, you could easily add stuff to the seed bank that way.
So to come back to the books, do you write simply because you have a story in you that you feel like needs to get out, that happens to be dystopian fiction, and that you get the opportunity to maybe write survival lessons in? Or is it the other way around? Is it you really want to teach a survival lesson and you wrap that in a story? Which direction does that work for you?
It's more story-based. One of the problems I had with some of the other books I was reading, and which got me into writing, was that the survival lessons would take away from the story. Like, they'd spend a page or two discussing the certain economic situation of another country and why that affects the United States here. And then you come back into the story and it's like, I forgot where I was even at.
Yeah.
So definitely story-based, and I do write other things besides post-apocalyptic fiction. Like, I do have another crime thriller series that I just wrote the third book for. I have a couple of action novels. I'm trying to branch out into other things besides the one genre, because I don't really want to be pigeonholed in the one thing. Like, oh, he's the guy that writes those kind of books.
Yeah.
Like how Stephen King got stuck in horror novels for the longest time, and then he had to create a whole another publish the other stuff that he was writing because nobody wanted to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So I do still, obviously, I still do post-apocalyptic fiction. The latest book I released is Homefront, A Story of the Future Collapse, and it's still the same genre, but I wanted to do something totally different from the previous books. And so I focused on a small group of Army Rangers on the West Coast who find themselves alone, and they don't really have any backup. They don't know what's going on, and things start happening around the Seattle area that they're the only police force to really take care of it. And it sounds a lot like other books that are out there, but they don't have all the gadgets and technology and the latest and greatest military equipment. They're really stuck with the leftovers of what used to be the biggest army in the world, and it's just a small group of guys really doing guerrilla warfare and the best that they can with what they have.
Mm-hmm. So is it more they're left with whatever equipment they had on hand whenever whatever went wrong?
Yeah. They obviously can't. It's five guys. They obviously can't protect or secure an entire military base. So they know that they have to kind of go off into the woods and play a cat and mouse game. At this point, the Chinese are the main villains in the book, and what happens is they show up. And at first it looks like it's all humanitarian aid type stuff, but then it quickly turns into concentration camp type things for their own good, of course. They're stealing natural resources that we have here. Countries like China, they tend to use a lot of concrete and steel when manufacturing buildings and stuff because they don't have the lumber. And so I really focused on the lumber industry and how, if they were going to come here, what would they be looking for? And along the way, the Rangers, they make allies with people that before the collapse initially wouldn't have been their best selection. One guy, his name's River, he's a eco-terrorist in the sense, like, he doesn't even know what's going on because he's been out in the woods for so long. Putting railroad spikes in trees, sand and gas tanks for cranes and stuff like that, sabotaging all these logging sites, and they come across this guy, and his skills end up becoming useful with fighting the Chinese who are coming in, because he knows how to do certain things that's really going to screw up their business that they initially wouldn't have thought of.
An interesting take. And I guess ultimately, what are these Army Rangers? Is it just they're just trying to get by and survive, or are they trying to get somewhere? Where does this story go? Like, where does it try to go?
They're trying to survive initially, and it's not until a year after the power goes out and there's a forest fire that ends up sweeping through the area, and that's essentially what destroys the base and separates them from everyone else. because there's no trucks, there's no planes to dump water on the fire, so the fire burns out of control, and they're stuck trying to survive that. And afterwards, they're trying to figure out, what do we do? These guys on military bases, most of them, they don't even live where they're stationed. You know, they might have a family somewhere else. So a lot of these guys are from all over the country. They're debating, do we go home? Do we do, like, what do we do? And then when they find out, through people leaving the city, that these ships showed up, and at first they're handing out food and stuff, but then the barbed wire goes up, and everybody's getting crowded into these areas, and we don't know what the heck's going on. And that's when they decide that their job is to still protect the country, and they gather whatever forces they can and put up a fight. So
okay. To back up to your other books that have led up to Homefront, what are the other cascading failures that have happened that bring us to the point where we get to your new book, Homefront?
Well, Homefront takes place at the same time as the initial, as After the Day, Remnants of the Day. It's the same time period, but it's a different part of the country. So you have a different environment, different culture. It's on the Pacific Ocean, whereas my other books take place in the Midwest, specifically around Lake Michigan. So
these books actually all take place at the same time?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's interesting.
So when one book is referring to the nuclear detonation in Washington, D.C., like, that's the same event that's really tying them all together. That's the initial day. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like when the clock went back to zero, and then everything after that day was different. Mm-hmm. And then a week later, the power goes out, and that's when all communications, all news, everybody in the country was really isolated from one another. And there's no information coming from outside of the country. Canada shut down the borders. I don't really talk about what happened with Mexico, but I feel like I can't, because I'm not familiar with the Southwest United States. I don't know what the culture's like down there for the most part. So I really stick with what I know and focus on that.
That makes sense. So cool. Where are you going to take your readers in the future? So what does the future hold for your books here? We've got Homefront, we've got all these other things. Are you going to do further down the line, or are you going to take another region and focus on that for a bit? How's that going to work out for you as a writer?
Well, I initially wanted to do Homefront as a one-shot deal. So it's one of the longer books that I've written. It's almost 300 pages. And after my beta readers went through it to get some feedback as to the pace of the story, the plots, any characters that didn't really seem real, things like that, the question they had for me is, when does the next one come out? So one of my problems with writing is that when I finish a book, I don't write the end, or not everything comes to a close. And I feel like I do that because that's real life. I get to the end of the day, yes, you're going to sleep, but there's something that happened during your day that you're going to have to deal with tomorrow, or you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The point is, there's always a tomorrow. And so with Homefront, there's certain characters that were introduced throughout the book that they don't really have a final point. They kind of go off into the distance, and you're like, oh, what are they going to do now? And that was one of the questions that the beta readers had was, so obviously you're going to take this character, and that's going to be another book. And I'm like,
you're right. Like, it is now.
So I've been fortunate with some of the feedback that I've gotten from it. So far on Amazon, it still has all 5-star reviews, which I've never had with my previous books. And the whole writing thing, for me, wasn't something that I planned on. I wrote After the Day, and I figured if I sold 5 copies, that'd be cool. And then a couple thousand copies later, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I should continue writing the sequel to that. and, but I didn't have an editor. I didn't have beta readers, nobody to really go over and proofread things. So uh, my my first couple books, you'll find a lot of complaints of like, oh, you need an editor, you need this, you need that, and that was all stuff corrected along the way. So when I published Homefront, it had already been edited, proofread. I had beta readers give me feedback as to the plot and the realism behind it. And I don't have a military background. I never served. My stepdad was in the Army. I have friends. I have several friends that have been in the Army, Marine Corps. I did have a group of vets or currently enlisted people go over the book to kind of give their feedback as to like, well, this isn't possible, and no, the staff sergeant doesn't treat people this way, or nobody says that to anybody, and you need more profanity over here.
Yeah.
So it was really good to get that kind of feedback and then go through the book again and change the dialogue, change the characters, take certain things out that weren't realistic, and didn't really fit the plot or the characters all that well. So that was really important for me to get that right, because I've had a couple comments in the past where people are like, oh no, that's not true, and it's like, that's based on a real story from a dude that I know that experienced that while at that base. And so yeah, you're always going to get that, but I tried to minimize that as much as possible with this book.
Oh, well, cool. Well, moving on to our lightning round, what is the best $100 you've ever spent in preparedness?
Man, people are going to hate that I say this, but probably buying my first Mosin Nagant.
I don't know. Why would people hate that? There's nothing wrong with Mosin Nagant.
People really love to bash it and trash it.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm on a budget. I want simple. I want reliable. I want affordable. And I feel like, yes, it's heavy. Yes, it's a bolt action. But for the firepower, the reliability, I don't want a bunch of gadgets inside that one little part breaks and all of a sudden the whole gun doesn't function anymore. And so, yeah, I bought my first Mosin Nagant for more survival purposes. I could take it up north with some soft tips and go deer hunting and stuff like that with it if I wanted to. So it does double as a hunting rifle. But yeah, it's kind of my collapse, post-apocalyptic go-to defense weapon.
As much as it gets beat up on, I actually know a lot of people that are on a budget and they chose it for that reason, and they're like, it's good enough. It gets the job done.
Yeah. And one of my favorite YouTube videos is called Mosin Nagant because people hide behind walls.
Very cool. So what's the best preparedness advice you've ever been given or heard?
Given or heard, I would have to say knowledge over equipment or storage. You can stockpile as much food as you want, but if you're in a situation that you have to bug out or leave, you can't take it with you.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever is in your head, that's always going to be with you. If you might not even be home when something happens, and as long as you know how to purify water, fish with items that you have on you, trap and hunt with handmade tools, stuff like that. Like, there's always a way to get by if you know how to do it. And I feel like a lot of people are more willing to throw money at the problem than they are really learning or acquiring certain skills that you're never going to lose once you have it.
That's great advice. So, and you've already taken out one of my other classic questions of what your go-to rifle is with your $100 answers. So we'll skip that one today. What, how do readers connect with you? Obviously, they can go to Amazon and they can pick up your books. But do you have a website or a Facebook page or Twitter? If somebody reads your book and says, this guy's great, I want to keep up with all things Mathew, how do they do that?
I use Instagram a lot. for the most part, that's because if I post a picture, I can instantly put it connected to my Facebook author page. It also goes onto my Twitter account. So that's kind of a double whammy on that. I don't really do anything with Twitter aside from share things on there. Facebook, I do post a lot of stuff, and I try to be as active as I can on there with people commenting, sharing things. A lot of my fans that I have currently reach me there. I do have an Amazon author page. I'm not on there that much. It's mostly for, here's my profile, here's all my books in one location. So if you just type in my name, everything that I've written is going to pop up on there. I have been trying to be more active on Goodreads, and I do have an author profile on Goodreads. And I've been finding that I get more reviews on Goodreads now than I do on Amazon, which I think is really weird. You think that people who pay for a product would want to review it on the place that they bought it, but instead they're going on to Goodreads and putting stuff on there. So it's pretty interesting how that's turning out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, neat. So if you had one place to tell listeners to go to connect with you, which one would it be?
My Facebook author page.
Okay. Yeah. And what is that? Give us that. How do we get there?
I'm pretty sure it's Mathew Gilman, author.
I'll be sure to put it in the show notes for today's episode. Well, Mathew, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. I look forward to seeing you grow as an author and seeing more great stuff come out from you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
As always, show notes, links, and resources from this episode can be found at intherabbithole.com/E183. And with that, we wrap up episode number 183 from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.